let's talk about the media's treatment of you. So the media's treatment of you for a long time, really since you sort of arose to international prominence, has been this mode of attack, whether it is the BBC suggesting that you're a vicious sexist or the New York Times suggesting that you want to force women into marriage, or whether now it is Ta-Nehisi Coates writing comics that portray you as Red Skull, Captain America's rival, the Nazi. He's a Nazi character. What do you make of these attacks?
Supervillain Nazi, because when Nazi isn't enough, when comparing you to Hitler isn't enough, there's always Red Skull. I think it's kind of hit a limit because the next step is Satan. Right? I mean, that's where you go after Red Skull. And what do I make of it? Thank you for your defense, by the way. Much appreciated.
Oh, yeah, of course.
I should say, look, there have been people in the media who've been supportive of me from the beginning. I would say in Canada, for example, there's 4 or 5 people who I think are among Canada's top journalists who have been firm defenders of me right from the beginning. And so it isn't every single person in the mainstream media, although there's a disproportionate number of people in the mainstream media who go after me compared, I think, to my popularity versus unpopularity in the general public. And I've thought about it a lot. I'm not exactly sure what to make of it. I certainly wasn't sure what to make of the last Red Skull episode. It was absolutely shocking to me. It took me about 12 hours to recover because I couldn't believe it was actually real to begin with. It was so surreal. I found out about it on Twitter. Somebody just sent me the cartoon, and the first thing I thought was that it was a Photoshop mock-up, just another meme. And then I looked into it a bit, and then I was really confused that this had occurred. It just seemed, especially when I found out who the author was, so that was a double shock. And then I decided to, because I'm feeling better and I have my sense of humor back, at least to some degree. And so I decided I'd just play with it instead of any of the other possible options that were open to me. And that's worked out extremely well. We've raised about $150,000 for charity because of it. But it isn't disappearing. It doesn't seem to disappear. And every so often, somebody comes out of the woodwork and takes another swipe at me and hoping that perhaps, hoping that this will be the time that I finally get wiped out. And, that's happened 3 or 4 times in major media outlets this year alone. The woman who interviewed me for GQ, she wrote a couple articles, one in the Atlantic Monthly, Helen Lewis, and she still seems to be quite disappointed in the fact that I exist. And Decca Aitkenhead in the Times in the UK, she was quite the piece of work. And then this last episode with Ta-Nehisi Coates, I thought about it. I'll tell you what I think. You tell me what you think about this. There are people like me, in some ways, like Steven Pinker or Jonathan Haidt, who are public intellectuals who are standing up against critical race theory and the worst of the leftist propaganda. They're rationalists and atheists in the main, scientists, and I have one foot in that camp. But I also have a foot in the mythological, dramatic, religious camp. And, Nellie Bowles, who's one of the journalists who came after me, she's the one who wrote the Mea Culpa 3 or 4 months ago, pointing out that she used her position to destroy people's reputation just so she could attract attention to herself. Surprise, surprise. And, she called me defender of the patriarchy, which was ironic in some sense, her use of that, but also an insult, at least from her perspective. But that's me. Both sides of it, the rationalist side, the Enlightenment side, and the religious side. And so have at her, boys. That's what I think. So I can't think of any other explanation, really.
No, I think that's right. I mean, when I saw what Coates had done in the Captain America comics, and I actually think that it does go to something root about our civilization at this point, because you talk a lot, Jordan, obviously, about mythology and the power of myth. And the most American form of myth at this point in time are the comic books, right? I mean, graphic novels are the form of American myth, particularly the Marvel Universe, which is the single biggest cinematic universe in movie history at this point.
Right.
And to take Captain America, who's the iconic American figure, turn him on his head so that he's opposing some of the stuff that you are saying, and what you are saying is reflective of Nazi propaganda. What it really does is it does place you in the position of Satan, except that the same people who very often are celebrating Satan in sort of his juxtaposition to God would never treat Satan that way. I think that you're worse than Satan because Satan is featured in Little Nas X videos as sort of something that ought to be imitated.
Right. There's a celebration of his rebellious spirit.
Yeah, your foot in that religious inspirational worldview does differentiate you from a lot of the other people who the left has somewhat targeted, but has decided is not really worthwhile. That's why I think that the way that you were described in that comic book, for people who missed it, basically the implication was that Red Skull was driving people to join Hydra by issuing his 10 rules for order and talking about the greatness of civilization and how you should make your room. And all of this stuff is driving many on the left up a wall, specifically because it's inspirational. The left knows that when it comes to driving the human heart, it's not enough to be a rationalist. You actually have to offer an inspirational program. And I think this is the great irony, is that folks like Coates, they do offer an inspirational program, but their inspirational program is an inspiration to tear down exactly the institutions of Western civilization you defend, which is why he has created this dichotomy.
Yeah, well, it's something that everyone needs to take seriously across the political spectrum. I mean, it's quite clear that we need a story along with our politics. And that's because the human heart demands an adventure. And that's especially true if you're young. You know, the developmental psychologist, Jean Piaget, who's a genius, a recognized genius, he has a stage of development. He posited the last stage of development as in adolescence as the messianic stage. It isn't talked about much in developmental psychology literature. I mean, Piaget was actually trying to reconcile religion and science. That was his life's work. And he investigated the development of ethics empirically in an attempt to bridge the gap between the is and ought. And he was very, very serious about that. It drove his whole enterprise. In any case, he pointed out that there is a stage of development in late adolescence that he called the messianic stage, where people are looking for, I suppose they're catalyzing their identity at the broadest possible level, which we would describe as religious. I don't care if you're religious or not. That's irrelevant to this discussion. At the highest level of generality, your identity, the best language to describe your identity happens to be religious, which is why we have a religious language, speaking purely from a psychological perspective. And what that means is that there has to be a call to adventure in order to keep people motivated to move forward in their life, both as individuals and as members of society. And look, George Orwell really knew this about the fascists, for example. I mean, Orwell was a profound anti-fascist. I mean, profound in the emotional sense and also in the analytic sense. But he recognized very early and had the courage also to point out that the Nazis had conjured up a mythos that was unbelievably powerful, and that the rationalist West had nothing in its armament to contend with that. And fascism, in some sense, it's more difficult to mount a rational defense against than communism, because the fascists do use nonverbal appeal, and Hitler used fire and imagery and fashion and architecture and art and culture in the broadest sense to move his political platform forward. The leftists, especially in the US, are quite good at the dramatic end of politics, you know, and the Antifa riots, that sort of thing, the Black Lives Matter protests. They're appealing to young people. And you can imagine, I always remember, I saw this kid in Montreal once. He was about 17, and he was dressed in punk clothes. He's a big kid, 6'5", like a big, powerful kid. And he was standing on the corner of this outdoor shopping mall with 2 pink shopping bags in his hand. And he looked like a fool. And it was partly because he felt like a fool, because there he was, this like monster standing there with these pink shopping bags. And I looked at him and I thought, geez, you know, if you went and offered him an overseas adventure, a warlike overseas adventure, he'd drop those damn bags and he'd be gone in a second. And no wonder. And so it's incumbent on us to realize that that call to adventure is necessary, and that it has to be built in some manner into our political thinking. And the left is very, very good at that. they're much better, the radical left, they're much better than the left centrists, and they're much better than the centrist right. Now, Trump managed that to some degree with his populism, but not to the same degree as the intellectuals, the dramatic intellectuals on the left.
I hope you enjoyed that clip from the Ben Shapiro Show Sunday Special. If you did, go ahead and hit the subscribe button so you stay up to date on all of our future content.